If you want to make sure that you don't hate Paris when you visit, make sure you watch this video. Hi, I'm Christina from happytowander.com, and Paris is honestly one of my favorite cities in the entire world. I do admit though, it is definitely a love-hate city, and a lot of people who come to Paris actually end up hating it so much to the point that there's actually a word for that specific disappointment known as Paris syndrome. Don't worry though, I honestly do think that the difference between loving Paris and hating Paris is just how prepared you are. So in this video, I'm going to be sharing all my best tips and tricks, all those things that you need to know for first-timers. Let's start with some Paris travel planning tips. First things first, make sure you're planning your Paris trip for off-peak periods. Contrary to that popular saying, Paris is not always a good idea and definitely not in peak season. So when should you visit Paris? Honestly, apart from July and August, I do think that there's reason to visit during any time of year. In May to June, you have the beautiful weather minus the peak of the crowds. In September, October, you get the fall foliage. And of course, Christmas in Paris, as you can imagine, is actually a super magical time to be visiting. So really the only times I would definitely avoid are July and August. And even August, a lot of people are kind of divided on that. Some people think that August is a great time to visit just because, generally speaking, there are fewer crowds just because a lot of locals go on vacation. But at the same time, the flip side of that is there's tons of tourists, so it's not going to be completely crowdless, and also lots of businesses are closed. So generally speaking, try to avoid it because there are better times of year to be visiting. Now, as for how long to stay in Paris, I would honestly advise a minimum of 4 days. That's not to say you can't enjoy a day or a weekend in Paris, but to be honest with you, if you want to get a good feel for the city, see most of the major sites, and venture a little bit more off the beaten path, then 4 days is definitely minimum. More days if you want to do some of the most popular day trips like Versailles or Disneyland Paris. Now, another important must-know is to book your hotel as far in advance as possible. Paris is definitely one of the busiest cities in the world in terms of tourism, so the best hotels, the most affordable hotels really do book up super quickly. And if you're scared of committing to a hotel really early on, what you can do is you can make a refundable booking through booking.com or something that has a free cancellation. That way you at least have a backup option and you have some more time to kind of delve into the different options. In terms of hotel location, honestly, what I would say is book as central as you can afford, because being in the heart of Paris is really important, in my opinion, to enjoying the city. If you're going to be staying really far on the outskirts or like out in the suburbs and commuting in, that really does hinder the experience quite a bit. So I would say try your best to stay central if you can afford it. So where exactly is central Paris? Well, for a quick geography lesson, what you need to know is that Paris is split into 20 arrondissements, or arrondissements if you want to anglicize it, and these are basically administrative areas or neighborhoods that each have their own town hall and elected officials. Now, both locals and travel guides will often refer to arrondissement by their number, so they'll say, oh, I live in the 18th or I live in the 4th. But you don't need to memorize all these numbers, it's not that important. What you do need to know though is if you're visiting Paris for the first time, I would advise staying as central as possible. At minimum, stay within these 20 central arrondissements because otherwise you're gonna be out in the suburbs and it's not really that fun to commute. Now, as for which ones are the best to stay, that really depends on what you're looking for. If you're looking to be close to the sites, often people recommend you stay kind of in this area because that's where most of the tourist sites are. Of course, they're very touristy neighborhoods, so they're gonna be a bit more expensive and they're also gonna have sort of like a more touristy feeling. There are a few neighborhoods that I would advise you avoid. So first of all, I wouldn't book anywhere near the main train stations, specifically Gare du Nord and Gare de l'Est, just because especially after dark, these areas don't feel to me super safe to be walking around in, especially not as a solo traveler. And others often advise avoiding the 19th and large parts of the 18th arrondissement as well. Overall though, if you're staying within this central area and you're close to a metro station, you're not going to have any trouble getting around. My main tips with hotels though, honestly, is just to diligently go through reviews, because odds are if the hotel is in a sketchy neighborhood or if there's something wrong with it, someone will have said something in the reviews. So make sure you comb through reviews, specifically read the 1-star ones and just kind of get a feel for what the pros and cons are of each place. Now, as for Airbnb, a lot of people will want to stay in an Airbnb in Paris because they see it as a more affordable option. Honestly, these days, I don't feel like Airbnb is that much cheaper than hotels just because of the fees that they add on. But if you're a big group where you want to have a space where you can cook, then Airbnb is still a valid option. That said, I feel like Airbnb has a ton of scams in Paris, or a lot of traps at least, that most first-time visitors aren't aware of. So I'm going to quickly go through them. Now, for instance, it is very common in older, more historical buildings in Paris to not have an elevator. So if you're traveling with a lot of bags, that's something to bear in mind, because oftentimes you'll show up and you'll realize it has a beautiful view because it's on a high floor, but then you're gonna have to walk up all those stairs every single time. So that's not necessarily the most convenient. Elevators, generally speaking, in these older buildings are not common. Now, another thing to take note of is a lot of the cheaper, more budget-friendly Airbnb rentals in Paris tend to be something called chambres de bonne, which are these small micro studios that are on the top floors of buildings. And traditionally, these used to be where household workers used to live. And so oftentimes with these apartments, they don't actually have a toilet inside of the apartment. Often they have a shared toilet that's at the end of the hallway or something. So just bear that in mind. That's again a piece of information that tends to be buried sometimes in the listing. So be sure to look through all the photos to see if they have a toilet, because it's shockingly common that it's a shared toilet at the end of the hallway, which obviously isn't the most fun. Lastly, noisy neighbors. A lot of older buildings in Paris are not soundproof at all, so you'll be able to hear pretty much everything your neighbors are up to. So just keep that in mind when you're staying in an Airbnb. Read the reviews because oftentimes people will tell you if they find that the neighbors are particularly noisy. Now, in terms of arriving in Paris, there are 3 main airports. There's Charles de Gaulle, there's Orly, and there's Beauvais. Now, if you're coming from overseas, odds are you're going to be arriving at either Charles de Gaulle or Orly. If you have a choice, Orly is a smaller airport and it's also closer to town, so the taxis to and from there are cheaper. That said, both are really well served by public transport and by taxi services, so you don't really need to worry about getting into town either way. In fact, both of them do have flat rates that taxis must abide by, so before you get into a taxi, make sure to double check what their fee is going to be, just because there is a flat rate that they're supposed to use. So if they quote you anything higher than that, know it's a scam. Now, Beauvais is quite different. It's quite far up north, and so if you're going to take a shuttle from that airport into central Paris, it takes about an hour and a half. If you're traveling from elsewhere in Europe or you're doing Paris as part of a bigger Europe trip, then Beauvais might be a good budget-friendly consideration just because you can often find really cheap flights into this airport. Just be mindful of the fact, though, that it is farther, so it's obviously not as convenient. Lastly, in terms of what to pack, at the end of the day, just wear what's comfortable because you're going to be traveling around a lot, you're going to be walking a lot, so good shoes are a must. But if you're wanting to blend in a little bit more and not look like an obvious tourist, then of course avoid things like athleisure or looking overly casual. Overall, you want to look put together, but with basics and kind of muted colors. Black is of course always a great idea. And honestly, the overall vibe that you're trying to channel is like an effortless chic. All right, now let's move on to Paris metro tips and tips for getting around. Now, first, be sure to use public transport while you're in Paris to save a lot of money. You're not going to need to rent a car unless you're going to be traveling and doing road trips kind of in the surrounding area. But even then, honestly, just know that you're not going to need a car when you're in Paris. Public transport is amazing, and if all else fails, there are taxis. Now, one thing I will caution you against, though, is a lot of the information online about the metro system is actually very outdated now, just because they very recently decided, after 120 years, to start phasing out the paper tickets that they historically have been using. So when you go to Paris, if you're watching this video right now, odds are in 2023, 2024, you're not going to really be seeing these paper tickets very much anymore. Instead, they're going to be using these contactless cards, which you can buy and load up with money. So just keep that in mind. So now here's some general tips for conquering the metro. First things first, avoid rush hour at all costs. Rush hour would be any time people are going to work or coming home from work. So generally speaking, like 8 to 10 a.m. and 5 to 7 p.m. This is the busiest time. And as a tourist, you have flexibility. So don't cram into the metro at the same time as everyone else. It's just a really miserable experience. In terms of etiquette, make sure you do stand to the side and let everyone out of the metro car before you step in. People can get really annoyed by that if you're just standing and blocking the door. And on that note, when you do go in, make sure you move in as far as possible so that you can clear as much space for people. For me personally, I love kind of standing in the little accordion section in between trains just because that tends to be less busy and I feel like I have more space to breathe. Lastly, be sure to hold on to your tickets or your card until after you leave the metro station, just because there are a lot of ticket controllers in Paris who are there to make sure that you are paying the fare. And so if you have proof of payment, then they're going to ask to see it. All right, now let's tackle some Paris tips for attractions. First things first, you need a sightseeing plan. I know that probably sucks to hear if you're like a go with the flow sort of spontaneous person, but Paris is a city with so many attractions that you really do need to develop a strategy or at the minimum, a list of places that you want to go. Now, when you do that though, make sure you're not overstuffing your itinerary. I think a lot of people, when they come to Paris for the first time, they tend to think they want to see every single thing, and they end up with this crazy itinerary that includes way too many sites, and then at the end of the day, they're just burnt out, their feet are tired, and they feel like they haven't really experienced Paris. At the most, I would say do 1 or 2 huge attractions per day, and then organize more fun, little, relaxed activities around it. Otherwise, you're going to get burnt out super quickly. And also, it's really important that you be honest to yourself and also your travel partners about what you really want to see and what you don't want to see. Because at the end of the day, Paris has so many attractions. Everything at some point has been called a must-see or a must-do by someone. So if you're not a museum person, don't force yourself. There are so many other things to do in Paris. There's really something to do for every kind of traveler. So be honest with yourself and also your travel partners. Now, when you do decide which attractions to see, one really important thing is to book your tickets in advance. You don't want to be getting tickets on the day of at the ticket office because that is time wasted. These days, you can buy pretty much every kind of ticket online in advance. And if there's an option to skip the line, make sure you buy that because in Paris, time is money. So it's really well worth spending the little bit extra so that you can save that time. Now, another tip for saving money, if you do intend on visiting a bunch of big attractions, is to look into either a museum pass or a Paris pass, anything that includes a bunch of attractions for one set price. I really like doing these because oftentimes I'll end up going to places I wouldn't have otherwise paid to go see, and depending on how many sites you're going to see, it can save you a bunch of money. And overall, if you want to do the math on that, it's very simple. Just write out the places you want to see, total them up, and see if you're going to save money with the museum pass. Now, another important tip is to wake up early. Again, I know this tip sucks to hear, especially if you're not a morning person like me, but really the best time to experience Paris is just after sunrise, when not all the tourists are on the streets and the streets are empty and you kind of feel like you have it to yourself. Even in peak season, when you get up at sunrise, the streets will be quite empty, and I just feel like experiencing Paris this way is just so special. And I know it sucks to be getting up super early in the morning, but it's worth it. What I would personally do is pick the #1 attraction that you really, really want to see, and then going there first thing in the morning and planning a little sunrise walk around it. Trust me, you won't regret it. It's amazing. Now, in contrast to that, another tip I have is to visit some attractions just before they close. So this is one of my favorite travel hacks. If you're going to a museum, oftentimes if you go about an hour before they close, the crowds will have already dissipated so much because nobody's gonna be trying to go to a museum an hour before it closes. But if you're efficient with your time and you're like me, you're not a dweller, an hour can sometimes be more than enough. And I have solid proof that this works because actually on Bastille Day several years ago, which is a day that all the museums are free, by the way, I went to the Louvre and I walked right in without queuing up at all. And this was about an hour before closing. This wasn't my first time in the museum, so I just kind of walked around for about an hour and I got to enjoy it with very minimal crowds. So keep that tip in mind. On that note, if you're on a budget, it might also be worthwhile planning around free days for different attractions. So what's really cool is in Paris, there are certain days that different museums and attractions will be free. And be sure to prioritize the free things to do in Paris as well, because not everything is a paid attraction. There's actually a ton of cool stuff you can do in Paris completely for free, and I have a full list of those on my website. Now, another thing that I recommend you do is really just research things to do in Paris beyond the touristy must-dos, because to me, when you go past the typical sightseeing circuit, that's where Paris really shines. And I have a really good friend, her name is Solo Sophie. She's got tons of blog articles about Paris that are really, really helpful and show you kind of different sides of the city. Definitely check her out. But generally speaking, you know, if it's raining, go check out some of the covered passages. They're really beautiful. There's also tons of parks where you can have a nice picnic. There's also the flea market, which I think is really fun to browse around in. There's also tons of local events and pop-ups as well. So be sure to look at local blogs and figure out other things to do, because this to me is where Paris is just really the most fun. Now I'm gonna cap off my list of Paris attraction tips with some weirdly specific tips that I think are really important. So first of all, don't get hyped up for the Mona Lisa. You've probably heard this already, but she's very small. You've probably seen photos of her before, and there's often a really long lineup to go take a selfie with her. Just keep your expectations low because she's quite a small painting. Another thing is when you go to the Arc de Triomphe, do not try to run across that roundabout. That's super dangerous. There's actually a tunnel that's underground. Just look for some stairs and it'll take you down this tunnel and you can get to the Arc de Triomphe safely by doing that. I've seen so many tourists just try to run across. It's very dangerous and honestly looks really dumb. Now, if you're trying to get good photos of the Eiffel Tower, oftentimes people go to Trocadero or they'll go to Champ de Mars. Of course, both of those are great, but if you want really great photos of the Eiffel Tower, remember it's this very big structure that can be seen from many points across the city. So if you even just go like a few blocks over, you'll often be able to find places to get a great photo of it with a fraction of the crowds. One of my personal favorite viewpoints is from this bridge. I feel like the angle that you get there is really, really pretty, but honestly, there's like 1,000,001 nice places to get a photo of the Eiffel Tower, so don't just go to the most famous viewpoints because there's so many people there at the same time. Lastly, in terms of getting around, I'd say avoid those sightseeing bus tours or those hop-on, hop-off bus tours, just because traffic in Paris is atrocious and these tours are really not the best way to get around or really see the city. In contrast, I think that river cruises on the Seine are super worth it. They're very touristy, but it's really just the best way to appreciate the city from the water, and there's not really traffic. All right, now, very important, we're gonna move on to safety tips for Paris. Now, the first thing is to always keep your valuables close to you and within sight. Most of the tourist-related crimes in Paris tend to be opportunistic ones, so a lot of these can be easily avoided just by keeping your valuables close to you and not just leaving your stuff around, because odds are if you put your bag on the ground and you're not watching it, someone's gonna snap it up. Now, a few common scams to look out for when you're in Paris. First of all, don't sign any petitions. You've probably heard this, but in Paris, it's very common for big groups of young girls to kind of come up to you, ask you if you speak English, and ask you to sign a petition. Don't sign it, just ignore them and move on, because either they'll be using this petition to distract you and they'll be pickpocketing you at the same time, or sometimes they'll get you to sign it and then demand a donation from you, and either way, it's not a fun time. Second, be sure to never accept bracelets from strangers. In some busier places in Paris, like around Sacré-Cœur and the Louvre, there's gonna be guys with string bracelets, and oftentimes they'll ask you if you want one, or if they get close enough to you, they'll even tie it on your wrist as a free gift, but then they'll demand you pay for it, and it's just really awkward because they can get very aggressive. So if you see these guys with the friendship bracelets, be sure to walk and ignore. Also, don't accept any free roses. Sometimes people will come up to you, give you a free rose as like a welcome gift. It's not a welcome gift. They're going to ask you for money. Or if you're a girl, oftentimes they'll ask your partner for money, whoever you're walking with, because that's just one of the oldest tricks in the book. So don't take the free roses. And lastly, be careful at metro stations. What sometimes can happen if you're at a metro station and you're standing by the machine and you look really lost about which tickets to buy, a very helpful stranger will come up to you and ask you if you need help. And then they'll go through the process with you, help you buy some tickets. But what they'll sometimes do is they'll take your money and they'll buy you the wrong ticket, like a child's ticket, and they'll pocket the rest of it. So just be mindful of that. Honestly, generally speaking, Parisians aren't going to just come up to you and ask you if you need help. So if somebody is overly friendly in that way, you know it's probably a red flag. All right, now let's move on to some food and drink tips for Paris. Now, the first thing is to beware of overhyped restaurants from TikTok and from social media in general. I feel like over the past few years, there's been some places that have just been super hyped up on social media, mainly for the aesthetic and not necessarily for the quality of food. So if you want to go to a place with excellent food quality, what I'd recommend is actually searching up different social media accounts that cater to a local Paris audience. So try to find a Paris foodie account or something, and then that way you'll be able to find places that are a bit more off the beaten tourist trek at least. Now, on that note, Paris is full of a lot of tourist trappy restaurants, so a few good ways to make sure you avoid that is by looking at the menu. If there's a bunch of pictures or if the menu is written in a bunch of languages in addition to French, that's probably a red flag. You'll often find restaurants like this advertising tourist menus or free Wi-Fi or things like that, especially in the Latin Quarter and other really touristy areas. So just be aware of that because most of the time the food here isn't going to be the greatest. A huge red flag to look out for is if there's a host outside trying to beckon you to come inside, because trust me, the good restaurants in Paris are not going to have someone doing that. Now, in terms of dining out at restaurants in Paris, there are a few basic things that you need to know. First of all, make a reservation if you can. Parisians are really big on reservations, and so make sure you book a table because oftentimes they're not going to have tables allocated to walk-ins. And if you're scared of calling them up on the phone, you can also make reservations with online platforms like OpenTable and The Fork, although of course the selection that they cover is quite limited. Also be prepared to eat later. Parisians tend to eat a little bit later than we do in North America. Usually dinner time will be around 7:30 or 8 o'clock or even later, and restaurants will often close between lunch and dinner as well for prep time, so just be sure to plan your meal times around that. Now, when you arrive, be sure to stand there and wait for a host to seat you. Don't seat yourself. They get really annoyed by this. You should also know how to get some free tap water when you're at restaurants. So if you ask for une carafe d'eau, then they'll bring you tap water. But if you just ask for water, sometimes they'll bring you a really expensive bottle. Like once upon a time, I was charged, I think, €7 for a bottle of water, which was definitely shocking. So make sure you ask for une carafe d'eau so that you get tap water instead of the fancy stuff. Of course, the best money-saving hack when you're in Paris is just to avoid dining out all the time. To be honest, one of the best things you can do in Paris is make a picnic for yourself. So go to a supermarket or a local market, grab some fruit, go to a bakery, grab some pastries, and just enjoy it outside. This will save you a ton of money, and it's just a really nice experience overall. Now let's move on to a very important section, which is Paris etiquette tips. The first one is it's super important to greet people when you walk into a shop or into an establishment. So if it's during the day, say bonjour. If it's in the evening, say bonsoir. They find this to be super important. So if you enter a place and you don't greet them, they find that to be the pinnacle of rudeness. And oftentimes that's when they'll start being rude back. So be sure to greet them. That's at the very least something that you need to know how to do. Otherwise, they can be quite snippy. And when you're leaving, be sure to say merci as well. On that note, don't take rudeness personally. Honestly, a lot of people think that Parisians are so rude and they let it ruin their trip, but I'm here to say don't. Honestly, it's not really a big deal. It's not a personal attack against you. Just culturally speaking, their customer service is not as bubbly and friendly as in North America. And also, they're used to dealing with a lot of really dumb tourists. So honestly, Paris is such a cool city, and if you let these aggressions get to you, it just ruins your trip. So don't let them. Don't give them the satisfaction. On that note, it is very important to learn some basic French. As I alluded to earlier, it's important to know how to greet people, so like bonjour, bonsoir, but you should have some other basics down as well, just because I feel like they tend to be way nicer to you when you do speak some French. I took French immersion in school and I can speak French decently well, which is why I think I like Paris more than most people, because they tend to be nicer to me because I try. So at the very least, know how to say, hello, know how to say thank you, which is merci, know how to say please and s'il vous plaît. Last but not least, try to keep your voice down. I think North Americans have this very valid stereotype that we speak very loudly compared to locals in European countries. So if you're in a place that's quiet, like in the metro, just kind of read the room. If other people aren't speaking, then try to keep your voice down or don't speak at all. Lastly, here's some final tips for when you arrive in Paris. Now, the first one is to get your expectations straight. Paris is a beautiful city, but it does have its ugly side because at the end of the day, it's a big city with big city problems. There's crowds, it can smell, there's garbage in places. It's not the most aesthetically pleasing place around every corner like you might expect from Instagram. So in my opinion, Paris is one of those cities that you love in spite of its imperfections. And so just keep that in mind. There are a lot of imperfections. Don't come here expecting it to be absolutely flawless in every way. Now, another thing is to be okay with things not going according to plan. I know I said earlier how important it is to have a strategy and plan, but in Paris, there can often be times when things don't go according to plan because of random strikes, because of random closures. And so in that case, you really need to be okay with that happening and be flexible and don't have your heart completely set on seeing specific things, just because from personal experience, there's always going to be something that's closed or covered in scaffolding, or there's a strike and you can't go see the thing that you've always wanted to see. So don't have your heart set on this perfect itinerary that you've created because odds are it's going to get disrupted in some way. Another practical thing is to bring a water bottle, especially if you're visiting in the summer, because Paris is full of these fountains that dispense really delicious, clean, cold water. So be sure to bring a bottle with you and you can fill up and you don't have to pay for water from any stalls or anything. Last but not least, be sure to carry some coins with you for the public washrooms because oftentimes you do have to pay. There are these free ones called sanisette, but they're not everywhere, so it's always good to have a backup just in case. All right, thank you so much for watching this very long video. As you can tell, I'm super passionate about Paris, and hopefully with these tips in mind, you're gonna love it as well. If you are from Paris or you have any additional Paris tips, be sure to drop them in the comments. And as usual, feel free to ask if you have any more questions. Thanks so much for watching. For more practical travel videos just like this one, be sure to like and subscribe. I'll see you guys next week. Bye.